From liver and onions that masked the taste of rejection to oxtail stew born from the scraps of men in suits and chicken feet sold off after the prime cuts were gone. This is the untold story of how poor families turned the rich man's trash into dinner. Let's start with liver and onions, which became the Monday night special in working-class homes across America. The organ meat arrived at your table with a metallic tang that no amount of caramelized onions could hide. You remember your mother standing at the stove, the cast iron skillet hissing as she laid those dark brown slabs into the pan. The smell filled every corner of your small kitchen, thick and almost sweet, coating the back of your throat. She'd fry the onions first, letting them turn golden and soft. Their sweetness meant to mask what everyone knew but nobody said. This wasn't choice meat. This was what the wealthy left behind after their prime rib and filet mignon disappeared from their plates. In the grand estates, the lady of the house would wrinkle her nose at organ meats, calling them peasant food, even as her kitchen staff packaged them up for resale. You'd sit at your formica table, cutting through the liver with the side of your fork, each bite requiring milk to wash it down. Your father would eat in silence. Your mother would say it was good for you, rich in iron. What she meant was, it was all you could afford. Do you remember how it felt to know, even as a child, that you were eating someone else's rejected dinner? Oxtail stew simmered in your mother's biggest pot for hours. You'd come home from school and smell it from the street, that deep, beefy aroma that promised something hearty, something filling. The bones poked through the rich brown gravy, and you'd fight with your siblings over who got the pieces with the most meat clinging to them. Your mother called it a delicacy, and maybe she believed it. She'd brown the oxtails first, letting the fat render out, then add carrots and potatoes and celery, whatever vegetables were cheapest that week. The whole thing would bubble away on the back burner, the bones releasing their collagen until the broth turned silky and thick. You didn't know that in the restaurants downtown, those same oxtails were trimmed from the premium cuts served to men in suits. You didn't know that the butcher bought them in bulk from the back doors of steakhouses, where wealthy diners sent back anything that looked too difficult to eat. You just knew that by dinner time, you could suck the marrow from those bones, and for a few hours, your belly would feel full. Today, chefs charge $30 for oxtail stew in trendy bistros, calling it rustic and authentic. Back then, it was just what was left over after the rich people ate. How does it feel to know your childhood comfort food was born from someone else's waste? Chicken feet sat in a bucket at the butcher counter. You remember them, don't you? Yellow and scaly, the claws still attached, looking like something that shouldn't be food at all. But your mother bought them, a whole pound for a quarter, and she'd bring them home in a brown paper bag that slowly soaked through with whatever liquid they'd been sitting in. She'd clean them meticulously, cutting off the claws, peeling away the outer skin to reveal the pale flesh underneath. Then into the pot, they'd go with ginger and scallions if you were lucky, just water and salt if you weren't. The kitchen would steam up as they simmered, and you'd watch through the fog as those feet transformed, the skin turning gelatinous, the tiny bones becoming tender enough to crunch. This was what wealthy Chinese restaurateurs sold to your community after they'd used the breasts and thighs for their American customers. The feet, the heads, the necks, all the parts that made white diners uncomfortable, all packaged up and sold to immigrant families who knew how to make something from nothing. You'd eat them with rice, picking the meat from between the small bones, and your mother would tell you they were good for your skin, good for your joints. She never told you they were good for someone else's profit margin. Can you still feel the texture of that gelatinous skin on your tongue? Pig's feet arrived at your house in a jar sometimes, already pickled, the vinegar so strong it made your eyes water. Other times, your mother bought them fresh, pink, and split down the middle, still wearing the remnants of coarse hair that she'd singe off over the stove flame. The smell of burning pig hair mixed with vinegar is something you never forget. She'd boil them for hours until the skin turned soft and the bones wiggled loose. In the wealthy homes uptown, these same feet were garbage, literally. The pristine pork chops and crown roasts went to the dinner table. The feet went to the trash, or if the cook was enterprising, to a middleman who knew which neighborhoods would buy them. Your father would eat them with hot sauce and white bread, pulling the skin off with his teeth, sucking the bones clean. He'd tell you it was soul food, and maybe it was. But whose soul was being fed? Yours, scraping by on $60 a week? Or theirs, making a profit on every part of the animal while you thought you were getting a bargain? When you see pig's feet in fancy restaurants now, braised and served on artisanal plates for $25, do you laugh or do you cry? Beef tongue lay on the counter like something from a nightmare. You could see the taste buds, feel the weight of it in your hands when your mother sent you to carry it from the butcher's scale. It was heavy, solid, purple-gray, and obscene. She'd put it in a pot of boiling water with bay leaves and peppercorns, and the smell that filled your apartment was indescribable. Something between meat and something medical, something dying. The water would turn cloudy. She'd peel the outer membrane off while it was still hot, her fingers moving quickly, revealing the pale meat underneath. Sliced thin, it looked almost normal on rye bread with mustard. Almost. But you knew what it was. You'd seen it whole. In the mansion kitchens across town, the tongue was the first thing removed from the beef carcass and discarded. Too strange, too foreign, too real. It reminded wealthy diners that their meat came from an animal with a face. So it went to market, to neighborhoods where people couldn't afford to be squeamish, where protein was protein regardless of where it came from in the body. Your mother called it a delicacy, because that's what her mother called it, a story passed down through generations of women who'd learned to call necessity by prettier names. The truth sat there between the slices, visible if you looked. You were eating what someone else found too ugly to swallow. Does the mustard still taste the same when you know the whole story? Tripe came in sheets, pale and honeycomb patterned, smelling like a barn. Your mother would soak it overnight, changing the water 3 times, trying to wash away the smell of the cow's stomach it came from. By morning, the kitchen sink would reek, and she'd scrub the tripe with salt and lemon, her hands raw from the effort. Then it would simmer for hours with tomatoes and garlic, turning tender and white, the smell gradually becoming something closer to food. You'd eat it in soup, the texture like rubber that had given up, soft but with resistance, each piece requiring commitment to chew. This was menudo, this was trippa, this was whatever name made it sound intentional instead of desperate. In the fine dining establishments, stomach lining never made it past the kitchen door. It went straight to the waste bins, or more accurately, to the distribution networks that fed working-class neighborhoods. The irony is brutal when you think about it. The poor bought the containers that held the rich people's food, eating the packaging while the wealthy consumed the contents. Your father would drink the broth, saying it cured hangovers, and maybe it did. But what it really cured was the question of what to eat when the wallet was empty and the week wasn't over. Have you ever wondered why comfort food so often comes from the parts of animals that no one else wanted? Neck bones showed up in your shopping bag most Saturdays. The butcher would weigh them out, these knobby pieces of vertebrae with just enough meat clinging to them to justify the purchase. 20 cents a pound, sometimes less if you bought in bulk. If you looked poor enough that he felt charitable or guilty, your mother knew exactly what to do with them. Into the pressure cooker they went with collard greens or beans, the steam building until that weight on top would rock and hiss, and you'd stand back because you'd heard stories of pressure cookers exploding. Hours later, she'd release the valve, and the kitchen would fill with steam and the smell of meat that had surrendered every bit of flavor it had to offer. The bones would be so soft you could almost eat them, the marrow having melted into the pot liquor. You'd soak it up with cornbread, and for a moment, it felt like enough. What you didn't know was that these bones came from the same animals that provided ribeye steaks to country clubs. The butcher would break down a beef carcass, remove all the prime cuts for wealthy customers, and package up the neck as soup bones. Different price, different customer, same dead cow. The wealthy paid for convenience and tenderness. You paid for the privilege of spending 6 hours making bones edible. When you see bone broth sold for $12 a quart in health food stores now, do you feel vindicated or just tired? Spam sat in your pantry like a pink brick of shame. You knew it wasn't real meat, not entirely, but it was cheap, and it lasted forever, and your mother could make it stretch across 3 meals if she was careful. She'd slice it thin and fry it until the edges crisped up, the processed meat releasing its own grease into the pan. It would curl slightly as it cooked, turning brown and smelling like salt and something chemical. You'd eat it with eggs for breakfast, in sandwiches for lunch, diced into fried rice for dinner. During the war, they told soldiers it was a delicacy, and maybe compared to K-rations it was. But by the 1960s, it had found its permanent home in poor kitchens. The wealthy wouldn't touch it. Their butchers sold them fresh ham, proper sausages, nothing that came from a can with a key attached. But the company that made Spam knew there was profit in selling scraps, the parts of the pig that couldn't be sold as chops or roasts, ground up and pressed into submission, sealed in a can that could survive the apocalypse. They marketed it to you as convenient, affordable, American. They never mentioned it was made from everything left over after the good cuts were packaged for people who didn't check price tags. You'd peel back that gelatinous layer on top, and underneath was something that tasted like meat's distant cousin. recognizable but not quite right. Did you know that in Hawaii, Spam became so integral to the cuisine that people still celebrate it? That's not heritage. That's making peace with being sold the bottom of the barrel. Potted meat came in those small cans with the key that twisted around the rim. You'd open it carefully, the metal peeling back to reveal a gray-pink paste that smelled like cat food and salt. Your mother would spread it on crackers for your school lunch, and you'd eat it, even though every bite tasted like betrayal. The label said mechanically separated chicken, or sometimes pork, which was a polite way of saying they'd taken every scrap left after the real butchering was done and forced it through machines until it became this paste. Bones, cartilage, organs, skin, all of it processed into something spreadable, something cheap enough that even your family could afford it. In the factories, they'd package the breast meat and thighs for grocery stores in nice neighborhoods. Then, they'd take the carcass, everything still clinging to bone, and turn it into potted meat for neighborhoods like yours. You were eating the residue of someone else's chicken dinner, mechanized and canned, sold back to you as protein. The crackers helped, giving you something with texture to distract from the paste. But you knew. Every kid in your school who pulled out that same lunch knew. This was poor people food, and no amount of clever marketing could hide it. When you see artisanal pâté selling for $18 in specialty shops now, made from heritage pork and free-range chicken livers, do you recognize your childhood lunch in a prettier package? Sardines arrived in flat tins, packed so tightly you couldn't tell where one fish ended and another began. Your father would open them with the attached key, rolling back the lid to reveal the little fish swimming in oil, their silver skin still intact, their eyes sometimes visible. He'd eat them straight from the can with saltines, the bones crunching between his teeth, the oil dripping down his chin. You'd watch, both fascinated and repulsed, as he'd offer you one. The taste was overwhelming. Salt and fish and ocean, so intense it made your mouth pucker. These were the fish too small to sell fresh, too bony to fillet, too much work for anyone with options. The canneries would catch them by the ton, pack them in cheap oil, and sell them to markets in poor neighborhoods. The wealthy ate fresh tuna steaks and grilled salmon. You ate fish small enough to swallow whole, bones and all, preserved in oil that had probably been used for something else first. Your father called them brain food, said they'd make you smart. What they really did was fill a space in your stomach cheaply, providing protein when the budget wouldn't stretch to anything with bones you couldn't eat. When you see those same tins in gourmet markets now, imported from Portugal or Spain, priced at $12 and called a delicacy, does it make you angry or just confused? Head cheese wasn't cheese at all, and you learned that the hard way. The first time your mother brought it home, wrapped in white butcher paper, you thought maybe things were looking up. Cheese was good, right? Then she unwrapped it, and you saw what it really was. A jellied loaf studded with pieces of meat, fat, and things you couldn't identify, all suspended in gelatin like insects in amber. This was a pig's head, boiled down until everything that could be salvaged was salvaged, then pressed into a mold and left to congeal. Your mother would slice it thin, the knife making a wet sound as it passed through the jelly, and serve it cold with mustard and pickles. The texture was nightmarish. Soft bits, chewy bits, gelatinous bits, all in one bite. In the wealthy homes, when a pig was butchered, the head went straight to the servants or the trash. Too much work, too many bones, too graphic a reminder of what you were eating. But someone figured out how to profit from those heads, boiling them down, picking through the skull for every scrap of meat, mixing it with the cooking liquid that had turned to gelatin overnight. They called it a delicacy from the old country, gave it a fancy name, and sold it to immigrants and poor families who couldn't afford to waste anything. You'd force it down, trying not to think about the fact that you were eating a pig's face. The gelatin would stick to the roof of your mouth, and you'd wash it down with water, feeling it slide down your throat. When hipster butchers started selling house-made head cheese for $16 a pound, calling it charcuterie, did they mention it was literally made from garbage parts? Giblets came in a little paper bag stuffed inside the Thanksgiving turkey your mother saved up all year to buy. She'd pull them out, the heart, the liver, the gizzard, the neck, and she'd treat them like treasure. Into the pot they went for gravy, or sometimes she'd fry them up separately, the liver turning dark and crispy at the edges, the heart dense and chewy. The gizzard required commitment, tough muscle that had spent its life grinding up the chicken's food, and now you were expected to grind it up with your teeth. These were the parts that wealthy families threw away without a second thought. When they bought their turkeys from fancy butchers, they paid extra to have them cleaned, which meant the giblets removed and discarded. But someone collected those giblets, packaged them up, and sold them to families like yours. Your mother called it making the most of what you had, but what you had was someone else's trash, dressed up and resold. You'd eat the giblet gravy over mashed potatoes, and it tasted richer than regular gravy, almost too rich, the organ meat giving it a flavor that was both familiar and unsettling. The texture of liver in gravy is something that stays with you, grainy, soft, dissolving on your tongue while simultaneously making you chew. Today, when celebrity chefs demonstrate how to make rustic country gravy using giblets, acting like they discovered some lost art, do you want to tell them your mother could have taught the class? Scrapple appeared on your breakfast table like a test of loyalty. Your father loved it, that gray-brown loaf of pork scraps and cornmeal, sliced thick and fried until the outside turned crispy while the inside stayed soft and almost creamy. The smell filled the kitchen, porky and earthy and slightly metallic. You'd watch it sizzle in the cast-iron skillet, the fat rendering out, the edges curling up. This was everything left over after the butcher sold the pork chops, the roasts, the bacon, the ham, the scraps, skin, organs, bits of meat too small to sell. All of it boiled down with cornmeal until it became this solid mass. In the wealthy neighborhoods, these scraps went to the rendering plant or the dog food factory. In your neighborhood, they became breakfast. Your father would eat it with maple syrup, the sweet and savory combination making it almost palatable. You'd try it, and the texture was the worst part. Grainy from the cornmeal, soft from the fat, with occasional bits that had more structure, that made you wonder what part of the pig you were actually eating. It was cheap, filling, and made from literal garbage, and somehow that was fine. That was normal. That was what being poor meant. When fancy brunch places started serving artisanal scrapple with poached eggs and hollandaise, charging $18 a plate, did they include the story of why scrapple exists in the first place? Bologna sat in your refrigerator, a permanent resident, that pink loaf that your mother would slice for sandwiches 5 days a week. You'd watch her cut it thin, the knife passing through that smooth, uniform cylinder, each slice falling perfectly round onto the plate. Sometimes she'd fry it, the bologna bubbling up in the center, the edges getting crispy and dark. The smell was distinctive, processed, salty, vaguely meat-like, but not quite. You knew, even as a kid, that this wasn't real meat, not like a steak or a chicken breast. This was everything left over from the slaughterhouse floor, swept up, ground down, mixed with fillers and preservatives, and stuffed into that plastic casing. The wealthy bought their cold cuts from delicatessens, real ham, real turkey, sliced to order. You bought bologna from the grocery store because it was 39 cents a pound, because it didn't spoil, because you could make it last. The factory workers who made bologna knew exactly what went into it. The parts too small, too gristly, too unappetizing to sell as actual cuts of meat. They'd grind it all together until you couldn't tell snout from shoulder, add enough spices and chemicals to make it taste like something, and package it for people who couldn't afford to ask questions. You'd eat your bologna sandwich with yellow mustard on white bread, the meat leaving a film of grease on the roof of your mouth, and you'd tell yourself it was fine. It was lunch. It was what you had. When you see gourmet bologna at the farmer's market now, made from premium cuts and selling for $14 a pound, do you appreciate the irony? Corned beef hash came from a can, dense and compressed, the fat congealed into white marbling throughout the reddish-brown meat. Your mother would open it with the can opener, that manual one that left jagged edges, and the hash would slide out in the shape of the can, refusing to break apart until she attacked it with a fork. Into the skillet it went, spreading and sizzling, the fat melting, the meat crisping at the edges. She'd crack eggs over it sometimes, the yolks running into the hash, making it almost seem like a real meal. The smell was industrial, salt and meat and something tinny from the can. This was the end of the line for beef. First, the wealthy bought prime rib and filet mignon. Then the middle class bought roasts and ground beef. Then the factories took what was left, the fatty trimmings, the tough bits, the parts stained from being near the organ meat, and they corned it, canned it, labeled it as hash. The potatoes in there weren't fresh. They were dehydrated and reconstituted, adding bulk without adding cost. You were eating the memory of beef, processed and preserved until it bore only a passing resemblance to the animal it came from. Your father would eat it with ketchup, drowning the hash in red until you couldn't see what you were eating anymore, which was probably the point. It filled you up, gave you enough energy to get through a morning, cost less than $1. When breakfast spots started serving skillet hash with fresh corned beef and hand-cut potatoes for $16, were they serving your childhood or mocking it? Pork and beans, straight from the can, the sauce orange and thick, clinging to the small white beans like paste. Your mother would heat it on the stove, maybe add a sliced hot dog if money was okay that week, and serve it with white bread for dipping. The beans were soft, almost mushy, having been cooked to death in the canning process and then cooked again. The sauce was sweet and tomatoey, with a chemical aftertaste that you couldn't quite place. This was filler food, designed to make you feel full without providing much actual nutrition. The pork in there was theoretical, a few tiny cubes of fat maybe, something that had once been near a pig. The wealthy ate their beans fresh or dried, cooked slowly with real ham hocks, seasoned properly. You ate beans that had been processed in a factory, mixed with the cheapest possible pork scraps, sealed in a can that could survive a nuclear winter. The company that made them knew their market, people who needed calories more than they needed quality, who couldn't afford fresh vegetables, who would buy whatever was on sale. A can cost 12 cents. You could feed 4 people. The math was simple, brutal, efficient. You'd eat those beans and feel your stomach stretch, feel temporarily satisfied, and try not to think about the fact that you were eating poverty, industrialized and optimized for profit. When food critics started calling canned foods nostalgic and American classics, were they talking about your hunger? Powdered eggs came in a box, a yellow dust that looked like cornmeal and smelled like nothing you could name. Your mother would mix it with water, whisking until the lumps dissolved, creating a thin yellow liquid that was supposed to become eggs. Into the pan it went, and it would cook up pale and rubbery, nothing like the real eggs that came from chickens, nothing like what appeared on breakfast tables in houses with yards and garages. The government had stockpiled these during the war, and when the war ended, someone had to eat them. That someone was you. The texture was wrong, too uniform, too smooth, no variation between the white and yolk because there was no white and yolk, just reconstituted powder. The taste was vaguely eggy, the way artificial banana flavoring is vaguely banana, close enough to remind you of what you weren't eating. In the wealthy neighborhoods, families bought farm-fresh eggs, brown and speckled, with yolks so orange they looked painted. You bought powder in a box because it was shelf-stable and cheap, and because fresh eggs cost too much when you needed a dozen to feed everyone. Your mother would add cheese if she could afford it, trying to mask the plasticky taste, trying to make it seem like this was a choice rather than a necessity. You'd eat them on Saturday mornings, washing them down with powdered milk, another gift from the surplus commodities program, and you'd try not to compare them to the real thing. When survivalists started stockpiling powdered eggs for the end times, calling them practical and smart preparation, did they realize they were preparing to eat like you already did? Liver sausage spread on crackers like wet cement, gray-brown and flecked with white fat. Your mother bought it in a tube from the refrigerated section, the cheapest lunch meat available, if you could call it meat. She'd slice it thick because it was too soft to slice thin, and it would sit on the plate looking exactly like what it was: ground-up liver and pork fat, pressed into a casing, sold to people who couldn't afford to be disgusted. The taste was overwhelming, mineral and rich, in a way that made your mouth feel coated, like you'd licked a penny. This was what wealthy people's butchers did with the livers after selling the prime cuts. They couldn't throw them away. That was money on the table. So they ground them up, added cheap pork fat for texture, seasoned it heavily, and created a product for a different market entirely. You'd eat it because it was there, because it was protein, because refusing food was a luxury your family couldn't afford. Sometimes your mother would add pickles to cut the richness, the acid providing a moment of relief before the next bite. The fat would stick to the roof of your mouth, and you'd feel it there for hours, a reminder of what you were and what you ate. When gourmet shops started selling country pâté made from liver and pork for $20, wrapping it in cloth and calling it French, were they aware they were just selling liver sausage to people who could afford to rebrand their poverty? And now you know. Now you understand that the dishes your grandmother served with pride, the recipes your mother learned from her mother, the meals you thought were cultural heritage, they were all born from someone else's garbage. If you enjoyed this video, click on the cards playing on your screen to watch similar videos.